Welcome to Fanko Decodes. I am Fanko. Let me begin by asking you two questions. They are uncomfortable questions. They are the kind of questions we usually drown out with noise, work, or entertainment because the answers terrify us. First, why would a man who possesses a towering intellect, a man who claims to despise his wife's character, who sees through her vanity like glass, refuse to divorce her, even when she begs for freedom? Why would he choose to shackle himself to a woman he fundamentally disrespects? Second, why would a woman marry a man she physically and intellectually looks down upon? Why would she seal her own fate with a vow she never intended to keep, walking into a prison of her own making? It sounds like the messy, chaotic gossip you might hear over brunch, or the plot of a modern reality TV show about toxic relationships. But the truth is, this specific pathology of the human heart, this intricate dance of contempt and dependency, was dissected with surgical precision exactly 100 years ago by a man named Somerset Maugham. Today, we are opening the pages of a book that stands as perhaps the most brutal revelation of marriage in literary history. It is The Painted Veil. This is not a romance. Do not let the title fool you. This is a horror story about the human ego. It prophesied every psychological manipulation tactic we now have modern buzzwords for: gaslighting, love bombing, the discard phase, narcissistic supply long before psychology was even a staple of pop culture. It rips away the comforting lies we tell ourselves about devotion. It forces us to confront a terrifying reality. That often, what we call deep affection is merely a disguise for arrogance and control. And what we call passion is nothing more than a convenient drape thrown over the cold, hard machinery of economic self-interest. To understand the cruelty we are about to witness, I want you to really listen to the confession the protagonist, Walter Fane, makes to his wife. This is not a man blinded by love. This is a man who sees with terrifying clarity. He tells her, "I knew that you were silly and light and vain, but I loved you. I knew that your aims and ideals were vulgar and common, yet I loved you. I knew that you were second-rate, but I loved you." Let those words sink in. I knew you were second-rate. It sounds like devotion, doesn't it? It sounds like a martyr accepting a burden. But strip away the sentimentality. And what do you hear? You hear suffocation. It is the equivalent of a modern partner saying to you, "I know you are a gold digger with no intellectual depth. I know you are beneath me, but I, in my infinite mercy, will deign to take care of you." This is not love. This is a spiritual evisceration performed from the vantage point of a god. It is an act of supreme intellectual arrogance. And yet, the irony is exquisite. This man, who holds his wife in such intellectual contempt, and this woman, who is vain and shallow, along with a third party, a narcissist of the highest order, engage in a dance of death. It is a story where the path to redemption begins with a desire for murder. The ending of this story does not offer the cheap catharsis of modern girl boss literature. The heroine does not simply win. She makes choices that have caused generations of readers to throw the book across the room in disgust, calling her pathetic. But it is exactly that ending that elevates this work to a masterpiece. Maugham teaches us that human nature is never black and white. The price of growth is that we must, with our own hands, tear apart the painted veil that we call civilized life. So settle in. Pour yourself a drink. Let us tear down the veil and look at the unspoken rules of the adult world hidden beneath. Chapter 1. The Manufacturing of a Porcelain Doll. To understand the tragedy of Kitty Garstin, we cannot simply look at her as a bad woman. We must look at the factory that produced her. If Kitty were alive today, she would be the ultimate influencer. She would dominate Instagram and TikTok. She possessed the two currencies that the world values above all else: breathtaking physical beauty and the appearance of a respectable, upper-middle-class background. But appearances, as we know, are the most deceptive things of all. Kitty's life was a carefully constructed bubble, blown by her mother, Mrs. Garstin. To understand Kitty, you must understand the terrifying ambition of her mother. Mrs. Garstin was a woman fueled by a potent mixture of resentment and aspiration. She was a woman of hard, bright capability. Her greatest regret in life was her marriage to Kitty's father, a man she viewed as a low-level, unambitious lawyer who failed to provide her with the social status she felt she deserved. Because she could not achieve social dominance through her husband, she decided to achieve it through her daughters. She treated her children not as human beings to be nurtured, but as venture capital projects. She employed a strategy we might recognize today as high-investment parenting, or what is colloquially known in Asia as rich raising. But let us be clear, this wasn't about cultivating Kitty's mind or her independence. It was about product packaging. Mrs. Garstin was the CEO of Kitty Inc. The family didn't have much money. The father worked himself to the bone to pay the bills. Yet every spare penny was funneled into Kitty's wardrobe, her dance lessons, and her debutante balls. Kitty was groomed to be the perfect trophy wife. The objective was cold and strategic. Kitty must catch a big fish, an aristocrat, or at least a wealthy tycoon whose fortune would retroactively validate the entire family's existence. Imagine growing up in that environment. Imagine the psychological conditioning. From the time she was a toddler, Kitty absorbed a worldview that was both incredibly cynical and tragically naive. She learned that her beauty was her credit card, and marriage was the checkout counter. She didn't need to develop a personality, an intellect, or a soul. She just needed to be decorative. She needed to float through ballrooms like a butterfly, waiting for men to offer her the world. And for a while, it worked. Kitty was the queen of the social scene in London. She was a master of the flirtation game, enjoying the adoration of countless suitors. She played the field, rejecting proposals from perfectly good men because they weren't rich enough or titled enough. She was holding out for the jackpot. But here is the tragedy of the market value mindset. It ignores the depreciation of the asset. Kitty miscalculated. She enjoyed the game too much, and she played it too long. She grew picky. She grew arrogant. And suddenly, she looked at the calendar, and she was 25 years old. Now, to a modern listener, 25 is young. It is the prime of life. You are just getting started. But in Edwardian England, in the brutal marketplace of marriage, a 25-year-old unmarried woman was entering the danger zone. She was on the precipice of becoming a spinster, an old maid. She was becoming shelf-worn merchandise. The atmosphere in the Garstin household shifted violently. The mother, who had once doted on Kitty, now looked at her with cold, hard eyes. The pampering turned into passive-aggressive commentary. The gaze that once said, "You are my treasure," now said, "You are a failed investment." You can imagine the scenes at the breakfast table. The clinking of silverware, the heavy silence. Mrs. Garstin would sigh loudly when a bill arrived. She would make cutting remarks about how expensive Kitty's dresses were, implying that Kitty was now a parasite eating into the family's dwindling resources. The love was conditional, and the conditions were no longer being met. Then came the final blow, the catalyst for the disaster. Kitty's younger sister, Doris, the ugly duckling, the spare heir who was never expected to amount to anything. The girl with the big nose and the dull personality got engaged. And she didn't just get engaged to anyone. She snagged a wealthy surgeon's son, a true catch, a man with a future. The humiliation for Kitty was absolute. It was a physical blow to her ego. If Kitty didn't marry immediately, she would suffer the ultimate social death. She would have to stand as a spinster bridesmaid at her younger, plainer sister's wedding. She would have to hold the flowers while everyone whispered, "Poor Kitty, so beautiful," but nobody wanted her. The shame was visceral. It was a suffocating weight on her chest. It was in this moment of panic, of existential dread, that our male protagonist Walter Fane walked into her life. Let's profile Walter Fane for a moment. Who is he? He is a bacteriologist. Pay attention to his profession. He is a man of science, a man who spends his life looking through a microscope at invisible truths. He deals in facts and logic in the binary world of life and death. He is socially awkward, introverted, perhaps what we would today call neurodivergent or strictly INTJ. To Kitty, Walter was an alien. He was short. He wasn't handsome in the dashing way she liked. At parties, he didn't know how to engage in the frivolous banter she excelled at. He would stand in the corner, watching her. When he did speak, he was serious. He was intense. He didn't play games. Kitty found him utterly boring. She felt nothing for him. She barely registered his existence. But Walter was possessed by a strange, quiet madness. He proposed. In a rare moment of vulnerability, he confessed that he had fallen in love with her at first sight. He offered her his hand, his life, and his devotion. Kitty's initial reaction was almost to laugh in his face. It was absurd? Me? Marry this boring little scientist? But then, the image of her mother's sneering face flashed in her mind. The looming nightmare of her sister's wedding crashed down on her. The fear of being left on the shelf seized her throat. Panic overrode instinct. Fear silenced reason. To escape the immediate anxiety of her mother's house, to avoid the label of spinster, and to beat her sister to the altar, Kitty made the first and most fatal mistake of her life. She said yes. She married a man she did not love, a man she did not know, and a man whose intellect intimidated and bored her. She thought she was grabbing a life raft to escape a sinking ship. In reality, she was shackling herself to an anchor and jumping into the deep ocean. She thought marriage was the finish line. She didn't realize it was the beginning of the trial. Chapter 2. The Architecture of a Silent Hell. And so the deal was struck. The transaction was complete. Kitty Garstin became Mrs. Walter Fane. After the wedding, the couple moved to Hong Kong, which was then a British colony. If the engagement was a mistake born of panic, the marriage itself was a slow-motion car crash. The tragedy revealed itself in layers. First, there was the social disappointment. Kitty arrived in Hong Kong with visions of grandeur. She expected to be the wife of a significant man, hosting lavish parties, being the center of attention. But she quickly realized that in the rigid, hierarchical structure of colonial society, a government bacteriologist was a nobody. Walter was a technician. He wasn't high administration. He wasn't invited to the governor's intimate dinners. He didn't have political power. The social status she had sold her freedom for was an illusion. She had married a man who was professionally respected, but socially invisible. But the deeper torture, the one that truly broke her, was the silence. They were two different species trapped in a cage. Walter was a man of profound depth, intellect, and silence. Kitty was a creature of surface, noise, and constant validation. Maugham paints this disconnect with a scene so subtle yet so excruciating it makes you want to scream. It is a masterclass in what we might call the weaponization of politeness. Imagine a humid, oppressive afternoon in Hong Kong. The air is so thick with moisture, it feels like a wet wool blanket on your skin. Kitty is bored. She is bored to the point of physical pain. Desperate to break the suffocating silence, desperate for any human connection, she looks out the window at the relentless tropical downpour and says, "It is pouring rain." Walter is sitting in his armchair, reading a book. He says nothing. He doesn't look up. Kitty, thinking he hasn't heard, raises her voice. A harsh edge of irritation creeps into her tone. "I said, it is pouring rain." Walter slowly turns his head. He lowers his book. He looks at her with a smile that doesn't reach his eyes, a smile that is polite, distant, and terrifyingly intelligent. He says softly, "I heard you." Can you feel the violence in that calm response? It is the ultimate dismissal. He is telling her, your comment has zero informational value. I have processed the auditory signal. I have no interest in engaging in your banal observation of the obvious. It is a rejection of her entire being. He treats her with aggressive politeness. He anticipates her needs. He opens doors. He pulls out chairs. He treats her like a fragile, precious porcelain doll. But he never treats her like a peer. He never treats her like an equal. Early in the marriage, Kitty tried. She really did. She wanted to bridge the gap. She asked him about his work at the laboratory. She asked about the bacteria he studied. Walter shut her down with a sentence that cuts to the bone. My work is very technical, very tedious, and very poorly paid. Deconstruct that sentence with me. Technical and tedious translates to, you are too stupid to understand what I do. Do not tax your pretty little head with science. Poorly paid translates to, I know you are a materialist who only cares about money, so let me disappoint you right now. I cannot buy you the life you want. This is the love of the arrogant. Walter loves her, yes. He worships her beauty. He is obsessed with her. But he despises her soul. He is watching her like a scientist watches a specimen in a jar. He expects nothing from her but to be pretty and silly. For Kitty, who is shallow but still a living, breathing human being with emotional needs, this benevolence is suffocating. She feels his judgment radiating off him like heat. She feels his superiority in every polite silence. She is starving for validation. She is starving for someone to look at her and see a woman, not a pet. And then Charles Townsend walked into the room. If Walter Fane was the dark, silent night, Charlie Townsend was the blinding, artificial sun. Charlie was the assistant colonial secretary, a man of high status, destined for the governorship. He was 40, tall, fit, handsome, and impeccably dressed. He had the charm of a career politician and the confidence of a man who has never been told no. He knew exactly what to say. He was a master of the social game that Walter refused to play. Upon meeting Kitty, he didn't talk about bacteria. He didn't talk about the weather. He looked her up and down with hungry, appreciative eyes and said, Good God, why didn't anyone warn me that I would be meeting the most beautiful woman in Hong Kong? This is the nectar Kitty had been dying for. It was like rain in the desert. Compared to her husband's silent judgment, Charlie's flattery was intoxicating. They began an affair. To Kitty, this wasn't just sex. It was salvation. She felt alive again. She felt seen. Charlie told her things like, When I saw you, you looked like a lily in a dark valley. It was corny. It was a cliché straight out of a cheap romance novel. But to a woman starved of affection, it sounded like Shakespeare. Kitty fell in love, deeply, recklessly. She convinced herself that Charlie was her soulmate. She rationalized everything. Yes, Charlie was married, but he told her his wife, Dorothy, was a bore. He told her she didn't understand him. He told her they were just good friends who stayed together for the kids. Kitty, in her tragic naivety, believed she was the exception. She thought, we are different. This is real love. I will divorce Walter, he will divorce Dorothy, and we will live happily ever after. She didn't realize she was playing a role in a script Charlie had written many times before. She thought she was the protagonist of a great romance. In reality, she was just the latest episode in a narcissist sitcom. She was supply. She was an ego boost for a middle-aged man who liked to feel powerful. Chapter 3. The Turning of the Porcelain Knob. The catastrophe arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. This scene is etched into literary history. It is constructed with the tension of a thriller movie. Kitty and Charlie were in the bedroom of her home, Walter's home. The servants were out. It was siesta time. The house was silent, bathed in the drowsy heat of the afternoon. They were intimate. They were safe. They were lost in their own world. Suddenly, Silence fell over the house. A heavy, pregnant silence. Kitty's eyes happened to dart to the bedroom door. And there, she saw it. The white porcelain handle of the door was moving, slowly, noiselessly. The handle turned all the way to the right. It held there for a second. The door was locked. The handle stopped. Then, just as slowly, just as deliberately, it turned back to its original position. Silence. Then, the sound of footsteps on the veranda. Calm, measured footsteps, walking away. Kitty was paralyzed with terror. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She knew that walk. She knew the terrifying restraint of that movement. It was Walter. He had come home early. He had tried the door. He knew. In that moment of sheer panic, we see the first crack in Charlie Townsend's armor. We see the difference between a woman in love and a man in lust. While Kitty was hyperventilating, burying her face in her hands, Charlie remained calm. Almost too calm. He sat up, buttoned his shirt, and smoothed his hair in the mirror. He turned to her and said, with a reassuring, almost patronizing smile, "Don't worry, darling. Even if it was him, he won't do anything." Kitty stared at him. "How can you know that?" Charlie replied, "Because he's a gentleman. He hates a scene. He is a doctor, a man of science. He won't want the scandal. He won't kick up a row. There is something chilling about his confidence. Charlie is banking on another man's desire to save face to cover his own sins. He is using the social contract of the British upper class, the rule that says one must never make a fuss, as a shield." He comforted Kitty, kissed her on the forehead as if she were a frightened child, and slipped away out the back. Kitty, bolstered by Charlie's confidence, began to calm down. Her terror shifted into a strange kind of relief. She thought, well, the worst has happened. The secret is out. Now I don't have to hide anymore. I'll confront Walter. I'll demand a divorce. I'll go to Charlie, and we can finally be together. She convinced herself that this was actually a good thing. It was the catalyst she needed to leave her boring husband and start her glamorous new life with her true love. She slept that night with a strange sense of peace. But she underestimated Walter Fane. She underestimated the cold, calculated rage of the scientist. She thought she was dealing with a man who would shout or cry, or perhaps ignore it. She didn't realize she was dealing with a man who was already planning an experiment. And in this experiment, she was the lab rat. And that door handle? That turning knob? That was not the end of her marriage. That was the opening of the gates of hell. A few days passed after the door handle turned. A few days of suffocating silence. And then Walter Fane struck. He didn't scream. He didn't break furniture. He was a scientist, remember? He waited until he had all his variables in place. He walked into the room, his face pale, his eyes cold as liquid nitrogen. He laid out the evidence of the affair with the precision of an autopsy. And then he gave Kitty a choice. A death proposal. This is, without exaggeration, one of the cruelest ultimatums in literary history. It is a trap designed by a genius to destroy a fool. Walter said, "I have volunteered to go to Meitan-fu to deal with the cholera epidemic. It is the epicenter of the plague. People are dying by the hundreds every day. The previous missionary doctor died last week. It is a death trap. I leave in 2 days." He paused, watching her face. "You are coming with me," Kitty gasped. Her blood ran cold. He was asking her to commit suicide. Or, Walter continued, a thin, terrifying smile playing on his lips, "You can divorce me. But I have one condition." Kitty looked up, hope flickering in her eyes. "If you want a divorce," Walter said, "I require you to bring me a written commitment from Charles Townsend. If his wife agrees to divorce him, and if he promises to marry you within 1 week of our decree absolute, then I will let you go. I will bow out gracefully. He checked his watch. I'll give you an hour to go see him. Now pause. Look at Kitty's reaction. She was ecstatic. This foolish, vain woman actually thought, "Oh, thank God. Walter is being reasonable. He is giving me exactly what I want." She didn't see the trap. She didn't see that Walter was handing her a rope to hang herself. She ran to Charles's office, her heart bursting with joy, thinking she was running toward her happy ending. She burst into Charles's office. She told him the news. "We can be together. Walter knows. He will let us go." And this, my friends, is where the fantasy dies. This is the moment I want every listener to burn into their memory. This is the narcissist's discard. When the stakes are real, when the game stops being fun, watch how quickly the soulmate becomes the stranger. Let's break down Charles Townsend's reaction into 3 distinct tactical maneuvers. Maneuver number 1, the appeal to career. When Kitty explained the condition, the color drained from Charles's face. The lover vanished. The bureaucrat appeared. "Kitty, dear," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "you know my position. I am a government official. A scandal like this ... divorce. It would ruin my career. I have the governorship in my sights. We must be practical." Translation: My ambition is the sun. You are just a candle. I will not burn my future to keep you warm. Maneuver number 2, the moral shield. Kitty pressed him. "But you said you didn't love Dorothy. You said you were miserable." Charles immediately pivoted. He put on a mask of pained virtue. "I may not be in love with her, but she is a good woman. She is the mother of my children. She has been a flawless companion. I could never hurt her like that. It would be ungentlemanly." Translation: My wife, whom I mocked to get you into bed, is now my shield. She is useful to me. You are a liability. Maneuver number 3, the victim reversal. When Kitty finally broke down, realizing he was abandoning her to the cholera, she screamed, "But you made me believe you loved me." "You seduced me?" Charles's eyes turned cold. He delivered the final blow, the classic gaslight. "Let's be fair, Kitty. You weren't exactly unwilling. A man is only a man. If a beautiful woman throws herself at him, well, I didn't start this." Translation: It's your fault. You tempted me. I am the victim of your beauty. I owe you nothing. Kitty stood in that office, stripping away the layers of her own delusion. She looked at this man, this god, and saw him for the first time. Beneath the tailored suit and the charming smile, there was nothing. No courage, no love. Just a hollow, selfish vacuum, terrified of losing his social standing. Nobody flips the table over a dessert. And Kitty realized, with horror, that to Charles Townsend she was just dessert. She returned to Walter. She was broken. Walter didn't look surprised. He just smiled that terrible, knowing smile. He knew. He had always known. He had engineered this entire scenario not just to punish her, but to force her to see the truth. Defeated with no friends and nowhere to go, Kitty packed her bags. She followed her husband up the river, into the heart of darkness. Chapter 4. In the Valley of the Shadow of Death, Meitan-fu. It was a city of the dead. The heat was unbearable. The smell of death hung in the humidity. Bodies were piled in the streets, waiting for burial. Walter threw himself into his work. He became a machine. He worked day and night, risking infection every hour. He treated Kitty with icy, polite indifference. It seemed he had brought her there to watch her die, or perhaps to watch himself die. But in this hellscape, something miraculous happened. Stripped of her parties, her dresses, and her social climbing, Kitty was forced to look inward, and she found ... emptiness. But in that emptiness, she found room to grow. She met 2 people who changed her life. First, Waddington, the deputy commissioner, a strange, monkey-faced man who lived with a Manchu princess. He was a jester, a truth-teller. He saw through everyone. He looked at Kitty and told her the truth about Charles Townsend, confirming what she already knew, but refused to admit. He is a second-rate man who thinks he is first-rate. Second, and most importantly, the Mother Superior at the French convent. One day, Waddington took Kitty to the convent. It was an island of peace in a sea of horror. The nuns walked among the sick and dying with a serenity that baffled Kitty. They weren't afraid. They weren't disgusted. They were fueled by a love that Kitty couldn't comprehend, a love that demanded nothing in return. The Mother Superior, a woman of aristocratic bearing, looked at Kitty not with judgment, but with a terrifying kindness. She told Kitty, "My child, peace is not found in work or in pleasure or in the world. It is found only in the soul." Shamed by their courage, Kitty began to work at the convent. She washed the sick. She held dying orphans. The physical labor, the stench, the reality of suffering, it scrubbed away her vanity. She realized how small her problems were. My husband hates me? My lover left me? Who cares? People are dying. She stopped being a porcelain doll. She started becoming a human being. Then, a twist. Kitty discovered she was pregnant. When she told Walter, his face remained a mask. He asked the question that hung in the air like a blade. "Is the child mine?" The old Kitty would have lied. She would have said yes, to secure her safety, to secure Walter's protection and money. But the new Kitty, forged in the fires of Meitan-fu, could no longer lie. She looked him in the eye, terrified but brave, and said, "I don't know." It was a cruel truth, but it was the truth. It was the first honest thing she had ever given him. Chapter 5. The dog it was that died. The end came swiftly. Walter Fane, the brilliant bacteriologist, caught cholera. Was it an accident? Or was it, as Waddington suspected, a suicide? Did he experiment on himself? Did he simply stop fighting? We will never know. Kitty sat by his deathbed. Watching his body wither away, she felt a tidal wave of regret. Not love. She still didn't love him, but profound pity and regret. She realized she had destroyed a good man because she was too shallow to understand his worth. She wept. She begged him, "Walter, forgive me. If you ever loved me, forgive me." But Walter Fane was not a saint. He was a man broken by his own intelligence. He looked at her with dying eyes. His lips curled in a final tragic irony. He whispered his last words. "The dog it was that died." What does this mean? It is a reference to a poem by Oliver Goldsmith, an elegy on the death of a mad dog. In the poem, a man finds a dog. They are friends. Then the dog goes mad and bites the man. Everyone predicts the man will die from the bite. But in the twist ending, the man recovers, and it is the dog that dies. Walter was calling himself the dog. He was the one who went mad with jealousy. He was the one who tried to bite Kitty by dragging her to this plague city to kill her. But the irony was, she survived. She grew stronger. She became a better person. And he? He was consumed by his own toxicity. His hatred killed him. He died of his own venom. It is a devastating confession. He died without forgiving her, and without forgetting himself for loving her. The final test Kitty buried her husband. She was pregnant. She was alone. She returned to Hong Kong on her way back to England. She thought she was cured. She thought she was a new woman, immune to the charms of Charles Townsend. But Maugham is a realist. He knows that growth is not a straight line. In Hong Kong, she was forced to stay at the Townsend's house. Charles, seeing her vulnerable and beautiful in her grief, cornered her. He turned on the charm. He whispered the old sweet nothings. And Kitty, who had seen death, who had found God in the convent, ... She slept with him again. Readers hate this part. They scream at the book. Why? Kitty? Why? But this is the most important scene in the book, because afterwards, Kitty didn't feel love. She didn't feel hope. She looked in the mirror and felt absolute, visceral disgust. "I felt like a sow," she said, "like an animal." It was this disgust that finally set her free. Before, she was attached to him by love, then by hate. Now she was detached by indifference and revulsion. The spell was broken, not by willpower, but by the undeniable reality of her own nausea. The resurrection Kitty returned to England. Her mother had died another liberation. She reunited with her father, a man she had ignored her whole life. She realized he, too, had been a victim of her mother's ambition. The book ends with Kitty making a promise to her unborn child, the child who might be Walter S. or might be Charles's. It doesn't matter anymore. She says, "I want a girl because I want to bring her up so that she shan't make the mistakes I've made. I want her to be fearless and frank. I want her to be a person independent of others because she is possessed of herself. I want her to take life like a free man." And there it is. The veil is lifted. Walter Fane refused to divorce because his ego could not accept that he had been destroyed by something he considered second-rate. Kitty married a man she despised because she had no self, no core to hold on to. But in the end, on the ruins of her life, Kitty Garstin built a soul. She learned that peace is not found in a husband or a lover or a social status. As the nun told her, peace is found only in the soul. She walked through the valley of death and came out the other side, not happy, perhaps, but real. And in a world of painted veils and social lies, being real is the only victory that matters. This is Fanko. If this story struck a chord with you, if you've ever felt the suffocation of a painted veil in your own life, leave a comment below. Let's discuss the masks we wear. Until next time, keep decoding the world.